We're going to look at aperture today. Right now what you're looking at is a really fine or small opening in the aperture. It's an f/22. As we open that and move to f2, you'll notice this is wide open on our lens, our 50mm lens, and this is the largest the aperture goes. The aperture controls one element of the exposure. As a larger aperture will let in more light, increase lighten the picture, darken the negative. As there is a smaller aperture, it will let in less light. You can also think of this as your iris. Your iris responds to light. When it's dark out or you enter a dark place, your iris, your opening, your pupil of your eye, I should say, will open, and as you enter a spot that is light, it will close down. Cat's eyes, right? So the larger the opening, the more light you're going to enter, that's going to enter the camera. Oftentimes the darker you're shooting. This also has an artistic effect, an aesthetic effect on your images. We're going to look at that right now and explain why and how some of these images are the way they are. So aperture oftentimes will affect what's called depth of field. Unless you're shooting a flat subject, for instance, this area flat, the aperture really doesn't matter as well. Most of the time though, we have distance or space in our images, and so the aperture, the smaller the aperture size, the more will be in focus in the image. In this image, you'll notice from the sign to as far as the eye can see is in focus. This is a little bit of an atmospheric haze as well. A little kind of, I would say, foggy day or overcast day. So not only will the aperture, record everything as clear as it can, but remember, we always have the atmosphere that plays a part in our images. But an example of deep or extensive depth of field created by a very small aperture. And in this image, I would have focused generally about 1/3 of the way in, and so we get this focus from feet away to as far as the eye can see. Another example of extensive depth of field is this image. So again, close to the camera we have almost in focus, but from here and to, again, as far as the eye can see, and honestly, as far as the eye can see very clearly is, I think it's defined as like around 30 feet. You'll also notice I've framed this image up, so there's a lot of framing going on. This is an early morning shot. And what I also want to show you, besides the fact that this is shot with a very small opening, an extensive depth of field, the small aperture making this in focus from the front to the back, that I've also kind of printed this up twice. As I printed it the first time, I didn't like how the signage that frames this image fell off the edge so much. So I repositioned it, so this is actually the final image, and you can see a little difference in as well as in contrast here as well. So the darks became darker, and so the sky got a little more tone in it, which is more true for the morning. Here's an example of a shallow depth of field or a really kind of small depth of field. The way that you shoot this is with a large opening or large aperture, as well as get close to your subject. In the works we've just seen, those were landscapes and we had a lot of distance in our work. When you get closer to your subject, you lose depth of field, so your camera focuses only on that foreground element and then the background blurs. And again, though, depth of field is really shallow and mostly created by using that large opening on the aperture lens. So shallow depth of field, really all that's in focus is in right here. Another example of shallow depth of field, and actually when I focus this image, and I can remember shooting this, this is all like in my area where I used to live. As I look at this, I know that I focused in the front, so I focused here, so I purposefully really wanted that background to blur, but wanted to keep most of what was on that barrel in focus. So again, another example of a large aperture used to shoot an image. That is, again, what we would call shallow depth of field. So a 2.8 aperture 2 aperture, a nice big aperture, and again we're relatively close to the subject matter. Here's a super shallow depth of field, so you can see here only like this area right here is in focus on this. This is inside of an old truck, so a 2.8, and again it's going away from us, so it has a really small area of focus. Shallow depth of field. Here's one that's kind of in the middle. I mean, I think it's relatively clear back here. So the picture is in focus here, so the depth of field is what I would call pretty extensive. It's extensive in the fact that I wanted to also record this element here relatively in focus. Now, if I wanted to only focus on the window, I would have used a larger opening or a 2.8 aperture, but this is more like an 11 aperture. Here's a really clear example of how also distance and aperture can change what's in focus. Here you can see the pole in front is a little bit blurred. You can see that the range of focus begins in you know, right about here. You can kind of see it happening. So it's back here, but then quickly I can change the focus by moving closer to my subject matter and also opening up my aperture a little more. So opening up the aperture, moving a little closer, you'll notice the only thing in focus here is this pole, whereas here I've gotten these poles. So this would be a smaller opening, this would be a larger opening. It's also a little lighter. And lastly, I want to point out portraiture. A lot of times when we shoot portraiture, you use the portrait setting on your phone. What that simply does is blur out the background, but it doesn't do it with an aperture. It does it by identifying an area and then sort of like in Photoshop, blurring that area out. What's also important about shooting portraits when you are shooting with a device that you can control the focus on is focusing in the forward. So when I took this picture years back, the focus was in kind of the nose area here in the front, and that way as it really got close into the back it blurred out. So focus forward when you're shooting a portrait, you'll get the face, it'll blur out, and again a large aperture helps to diminish the background, and so the focus is on the person. And here's another example of a portrait I wanted to bring out. I love this Shayla. The thing that's interesting about this is not only did I was inside, I'm sure, I was using a pretty big aperture, so there's very little in focus, so focus was really important, but this child was also in movement. So the cool thing about that is there's a little bit of blur that's happening twofold. One, because of the aperture, but also because the shutter speed is probably around a 60th of a second. So if there's a quick movement there, that shake was also recorded, especially right there. You can see that happening. But again, a really shallow depth of field, large opening, shot inside. You oftentimes need these large openings inside. That's why it is difficult often to use a small aperture inside, because you'll have to use a tripod, because this cuts down the light so much that you can't hold the camera below 60. So a little kind of roundabout of how you shoot with apertures and the variety of things you can get. Another thing to think about is sometimes it's not important to consider the aperture. If your focus is on movement, then you use shutter priority. If you're using aperture priority, it's something that you can set on in the DSLRs, some of them I should say, the setting is AV. And then you set your aperture and it'll set your shutter speed to whatever you want. These, in fact, are TV shutter priority. So priority was given to recording the movement here. Some images, it just really doesn't matter if they're not moving, that the aperture then takes priority, and you control what you want to have in focus by understanding your aperture. There's also something called a depth of field scale on here. So as I use a depth of field scale, I can actually see in feet, and in this case also meters, how much is going to be in focus. So if I'm at a 2 aperture and I am, let's say I am 3 feet away from my subject, the only thing that's going to be in focus is about 3 feet. But if I am at a 22 and I'm 3 feet away from, I'm going to get everything from 2.5 to about almost 4 feet away in focus. So this depth of field scale is really a handy device to understand really exactly what is going to be in focus. And again, you're going to see a little of that as a single lens reflex is about you being able to see exactly what the picture will look like in your viewfinder. Unlike the rangefinder, you're shooting through the same hole that you are framing and seeing your picture through. So it's a little heads up on that. That helps a lot. Again, shutter dials, aperture, and ISO are that exposure triangle. Pyramid?